Not since the War of 1812 has the Capitol been breached. That became the media's soundbite frequently heard in the minutes, hours, and days following the January 6th storming of the Capitol by domestic terrorists. While the country continues to work to grapple with and unpack the events of that day, what do we remember of that prior attack on the Capitol more than 200 years ago? That is what we will unpack today with renowned historian and Pulitzer Prize winning author Dr. Alan Taylor. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the vice president at the JES and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. In this talk, the Pulitzer Prize winning historian, author, and professor Dr. Taylor will examine the means and motives of the British invasion of the Chesapeake and explain why they burned the Capitol, the White House, and other selected targets. He will place this military assault in political context of a deeply divided nation embroiled in intense partisan conflict as most Federalists work to undermine a war effort associated with the governing Democratic and Democratic Republicans led by President James Madison. Before we get to the program, a bit about Dr. Taylor. In August of 2014, he was appointed to hold the Thomas Jefferson Chair in American History at the University of Virginia. Prior, starting in 1994, he taught courses in early North American history, history of the American West, and the history of Canada at the University of California at Davis, where in 2002 he won the University of California at Davis Award for Teaching and Scholarly Achievement and the Phi Beta Kappa Northern California Association Teaching Excellence Award. He's the author of 7 books, including The Civil War of 1812, American Citizens, British Subjects, Irish Rebels, and Indian Allies, which we'll focus on here, as well as William Cooper's Town, Power and Persuasion on the Frontier of the Early American Republic, and The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, both of which earned him those Pulitzer Prizes. And in 2020, he was elected to the American Philosophical Society. For a fuller biography, please do head over to our website, jeserie.org. Now, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this program, still send us your questions to keep this conversation going. And for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Alan Taylor to the JES digital stage. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you, Ben, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for all your help in setting up this presentation. And I want to thank all of you viewers for joining us today. The War of 1812 is a rather obscure set of episodes in American history, but I think it's one that's extremely important. And it was a very divisive war. The governing party, led by President James Madison, you see James Madison on the left, and his wife Dolly Madison on the right. The governing Democratic Republicans were very upset with the British Empire for its aggressive policies toward American shipping and American sailors on the high sea, and also upset with the British for assisting Native Americans in the then American West who were resisting American expansion. Now, the British felt justified in these measures because they were embroiled in a global war against the mighty French Empire led by Napoleon Bonaparte. And the British saw themselves as defending the liberty of other countries in the world against the expansionism being waged with military power by Napoleon. And they expected the United States to be indulgent and to look the other way as American merchant ships were blocked from trading in Europe, in some cases confiscated for that trade, and also that American sailors were being taken off and forcibly recruited into the Royal Navy. But Madison and the governing Democratic Republicans became fed up and in June of 1812 declared war on the British Empire. This was a war that was strongly supported by the Democratic Republicans, who were strongest in the Middle Atlantic region, including Pennsylvania, in the South, and in the Western states. But it was unpopular in the Northeast, especially New England, where the Federalists were strong. And the Federalists tended to agree with Britain that Britain was working on behalf of the wider world by fighting Napoleon. And the Federalists also worried that their shipping would be exposed to British attack. And the Federalists also noted that the United States was woefully unprepared for war. The war effort on behalf of the United States focused on invading Canada. And in the course of these invasions, which began during the summer of 1812, the American forces inflicted a great deal of damage to civilian homes, farms, and villages, but suffered a series of defeats, surprising defeats against smaller numbers. And here is a painting representing one of those defeats from October of 1812 at Queenston along the Niagara River, on the border between New York, which appears on the left, and then Queenston on the Canadian side of the border on the right. Now, the British regarded this invasion as something of a sucker punch because they had their hands full. 1812, Napoleon's at the peak of his power. He's just begun his invasion of Russia. And Napoleon's forces dominated the rest of Europe. And Britain was feeling very much beleaguered, and they did not welcome being attacked from a new direction. The United States was not formally allied with Napoleon, but by attacking the British, they were indirectly helping Napoleon, and that quite outraged the British. The man you see standing so confidently in this image is Admiral George Cockburn. Cockburn was put in charge of British naval operations in Chesapeake Bay. Beginning in early 1813, the British exploited their naval supremacy by sending a naval strike force into Chesapeake Bay. And they used their superior mobility in order to attack all shores of the bay. And what they were trying to do was to destroy resources useful to the American war effort, including the produce of these farms. But also it's a bit of political theater. It's meant to show that the British can punish places that were strongly supporting the Democratic Republicans, especially Virginia, but also Maryland. And the hope is that they can inflict enough economic pain and enough political embarrassment on the Madison administration to compel them to make peace so that the British could return to their primary mission, which was fighting Napoleon in Europe. Now, Cockburn was an extremely competent admiral, but also a very bombastic one, very theatrical admiral, as you can see in his personal presentation here. And so he delighted in opportunities to embarrass the Americans, to show their resistance to be futile. And he has it as his primary ambition that he would like the opportunity to strike at Washington, D.C., to really expose the Madison administration as weak and incompetent. And he hoped that thereby it would lead Americans to reject the Democratic Republican Party and rally to the Federalists. Now, the British operations in the Chesapeake started in a relatively modest way in 1813, but they will expand dramatically in 1814 for a couple of reasons. One is that the British succeed in defeating Napoleon with the help of allies. They defeat Napoleon in Europe, and it frees up veteran British troops and sailors to cross the Atlantic and engage in the war against the Americans. So in the British perspective, 1814 is payback time. They're really quite bitter toward the Americans. Lord Eglinton, a British political leader, declared, quote, "The only thing now is those cursed Americans. I hope a sufficient force will be sent to crush them at once, to attack their strongholds, arsenals, shipping, and naval yards and destroy them. Well, Cockburn is entirely on board with this mission. And he now feels that he has the troops that he will need in order to take this on. Now, those troops include a new unit known as the Colonial Marines. Colonial Marines, the recruits are former slaves who have run away from their masters in Virginia and Maryland to enlist in British forces. And they quickly become the most effective unit that Cockburn has available to him. They're highly motivated because they are going to be striking back against their former masters. And they certainly aren't going to desert because they don't want to go back to a life in slavery. And Cockburn comes to rely upon them very heavily. They're also very well informed about the landscape. They know the paths, they know the roads, they know the streams. They know where stockpiles of food can be found. They know where the militia of Maryland or Virginia tend to rally. And the effectiveness of British raids become much better during 1814 because of the assistance of these colonial Marines. The painting you see here is a modern painting. It's a very well-informed one, and it shows the range of operations involving colonial Marines. They are in the foreground, and they are gathering together barrels to destroy them. So these raids are meant to destroy economic resources of the Americans. In the background, you see a British officer directing another African-American family to waiting British boats. So these raids are not only destroying American resources, but they're also helping enslaved people to escape from slavery. And they are brought to Tangier Island, which the British occupy in Chesapeake Bay and use as their primary naval base. And there the men are recruited to serve either in the Royal Navy as sailors or more commonly as colonial Marines. In the background in this image, you see a ship burning, so the British are also destroying resources that they can't take away. Call your attention to the contrast between these two maps. On the left shows British operations in 1813 in Chesapeake Bay. And you see everywhere that you see a ship represented or you see something in flames, that indicates places that the British attacked. It seems by this map that British attacks are fairly randomly arranged through the entire course of Chesapeake Bay, both the eastern and western shores and the northern and southern reaches of that bay. If you look over to the right, you see British engagements in 1814. This is when they have the assistance of a large number of colonial Marines and also of reinforcements from Britain. And you can see that the attacks are really focused on southern Maryland. And there's a reason for this. Cockburn is softening up resistance along the route to Washington, D.C. These are also areas in which there are a great number of enslaved people who can be recruited to become colonial Marines and to assist British operations. Southern Maryland is also an area in which there's considerable Federalist sentiment. In other words, active resistance will be a lot lower in Southern Maryland than anywhere else in this region. Now, Cockburn makes it clear to civilians that if they don't resist, if they stay home, and they will sell their produce and their livestock to him to help feed his sailors and Marines, that he'll leave them alone. But all bets are off if they resist in any way. A British captain noted, quote, "If they run away and stock driven off, then we hunt for that stock, drive it down to the boats and take it off as plunder and fire their houses." So it's a real carrot and stick approach, and it's effective. The British find that there's very little resistance in Southern Maryland. The commander of the militia in Calvert County is a man named Michael Tawney. He is the father of the later Chief Justice, Roger B. Tawney. Well, Colonel Tawney is in command of the militia, but instead of leading the militia to the fight, he tells them to stay home, and Tawney is selling cattle to the British and making a nice profit and preserving his nice plantation from British attack. After just 120 British raiders marched 7 miles without opposition inland and then back, a federal official declared, quote, "The people are all frightened out of their senses, running about the country like so many mad people," end quote. And Coburn's delighted about this passivity. He said, quote, "The whole of the fine country in this neighborhood is completely at our disposal and mercy." Now, he achieves this by August of 1814, and then he puts the major operation into motion. He's been reinforced by 4,500 British troops fresh from Europe under the command of General Robert Ross. And they go up the Patuxent River, which is just to the east of the Potomac. And this is the back door to Washington. And they face no resistance until they get to the upper reaches of the river. They destroy a gunboat flotilla of the US Navy that could not escape. And then they march overland the short distance to the suburb of Washington known as Bladensburg. And there they find no resistance from regular soldiers because the American regular soldiers had been posted to invade Canada to the north. Instead, they are fighting against the American militia, the state militia of Maryland, and then the militia of the District of Columbia. Now, here's a satirical image of the militia. The militiamen were just farmers and shopkeepers and artisans who had virtually no training and would usually just come together once a year for a muster that involved more drinking than training. This is a satirical image, but it's not too far from the sad reality of relying upon an untrained militia. By contrast, the British troops and the sailors accompanying them, led by Coburn, are veterans of years of warfare in Europe, much of it under the command of Lord Wellington. So it is, although the American militia at Bladensburg, it outnumbers the British by 7,000 to 4,500, it's a very one-sided fight. The British crossed the river, scattered the Americans, the militia threw down their guns and ran away. It's then very easy for the British to walk into Washington, D.C., where they find chaos and panic. Now, an observer of this route said, quote, "The militia ran like sheep chased by dogs." The most delighted witnesses of this scene were enslaved people who saw this as an opportunity for them to escape from slavery. A British officer reported, quote, "On ascending the rise of the Turnpike Road, from which we had just driven the enemy, we were greeted by a group of Negroes to whom our victory gave freedom. They were, of course, rejoiced beyond measure at the happy change in their circumstances and manifested their joys in 1,000 extravagant ways," end quote. Now, as I said, chaos and panic are reigning in Washington, D.C. A resident of that city, a woman named Margaret Bayard Smith, pitied, quote, "Our poor broken militia. Every hour, the poor, wearied, and terrified creatures are passing by the door. Our men look pale and feeble, but with more from fright than fatigue. They had thrown away their muskets and blankets," end quote. Federal officials, including President Madison, evacuated from the city, taking away their records, and fled into the countryside. Exploiting the confusion, local looters spread through the city before the British troops arrived. Madison's body servant recalled, quote, "A rabble taking advantage of the confusion ran all over the White House and stole lots of silver and whatever they could lay their hands on," end quote. So these are American civilians. These are not the British quite yet. At dusk, the British troops marched into the city. The only resistance that they found was an occasional sniper. And the only loss from a sniper was one horse shot from under General Ross. The departing American officers had set fire to the naval yard. So the entire scene is lit up, giving a red hue to everyone, not just the redcoats. Breaking into the White House, British officers scattered the looters, and then these officers settled down to enjoy the meal that the Madisons had suddenly left behind. Cockburn then ordered his sailors and Colonial Marines to set fire to the White House. Now, the British did not burn the entire city. They left most of the city alone. They left civilian homes alone unless they found snipers in them. And so there were only 2 of those homes that got burned. But government buildings were burned, and a newspaper that supported the Democratic Republicans also was burned by the British. So the buildings burned were primarily the White House, the Capitol building, the War Office, the Treasury building, and that newspaper office. Now, Cockburn, as I said, is a very gifted ham actor, and he regards this as his greatest moment on stage. And he's playing to an audience of American civilians, and especially the women who remained in the city. Cockburn fancied himself quite a gallant. In this particular image, you see the burning. It's a British image, and it truncates the distance, the actual distance between the White House, which is on the left, and the Capitol on the right, and then the newspaper office, which is on the very right fringe of this image. But Cockburn is this great ham actor, and what he wants to do is highlight that the British are in charge here, that the Americans were incompetent, that James Madison, whom he called Jemmy, had done nothing to really defend the city, but that he is going to, in a very flamboyant way, show that he's going to protect civilian property. Admiral appealed to a young lady by saying, quote, "Don't be afraid, I will take better care of you than Jemmy did," end quote. Margaret Bayard Smith conceded, quote, "He and all his officers and soldiers were perfectly polite to the citizens," end quote. At sunset on August 25, after occupying the city for just 24 hours, the British marched away, covering 50 miles unopposed to reach the Patuxent late on August 26th. There they re-embarked on their ships, and they headed back down to Tangier Bay to regroup for their next attack, which would take place in September and would target the city of Baltimore. And there things played out quite differently, with the British defeat memorialized by Francis Scott Key, who witnessed this event and wrote the song that would later become the American national anthem. Now, in this image of Cockburn here, he is showing his pride in the capture and partial burning of Washington, D.C. So in the background, that's Washington, D.C.'s buildings burning. So Cockburn had a very long and quite accomplished naval career. But in this career, the moment that he picked for his grand portrait is the burning of Washington. It's the thing he's proudest of. This is a very different image it shows the burned Capitol. And this is produced by an American, Jesse Torrey, in 1817, just a couple of years after this event. This is, and if you look at the details of it, you can see that Torrey is trying to score some points here. In the right foreground, you see a group of enslaved people in chains being led by a slave trader. Meanwhile, another well-dressed gentleman beside him is gesturing toward the Capitol building in ruins. So Torrey is trying to make a connection between slavery and the destruction of the Capitol. And that connection also appears in the figures in the upper right corner, these rather celestial figures, one of whom is holding a Liberty cap. So what Torrey is trying to say in this image is that Americans' sin of keeping people in slavery, despite their professions to be the Republic of Liberty, it is that sin that had led to a divine punishment using the British as instruments, in which the punishment consisted of the burning of the American Capitol. I will stop my presentation there and welcome questions that Ben has, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you to ask the questions that you may have.
So, Dr. Taylor, thank you for setting that context for us and walking us through the history. And in the beginning, you noted that the War of 1812 is more obscure in American history. So I'm curious what initially drew you to study this war and what led you to ultimately want to write a book, The Civil War of 1812, American Citizens, British Subjects, Irish Rebels, and Indian Allies. What led you to write a book about this?
Well, it began quite a long time ago, back when I was in college, and I had an opportunity to do original research in the Maine Historical Society. And I came across a fascinating set of letters written to the man who was the commander of the militia in Maine during the War of 1812. And I realized that I knew next to nothing about the war, and that the war generates a lot of documents because people have to explain themselves to superiors, to inferiors. And so it turns out that a lot of the documentation of by these military commanders, particularly militia officers, in this case, a militia officer on the coast of Maine, are very revealing about social conditions, very revealing about the behavior of common people. And as a social historian, I'm of course interested in what leaders do, but I'm even more interested in what's harder to find out, which is your ordinary man and woman. And I found that by studying the War of 1812, I suddenly had a whole array of documents that would enable me to understand American society of the time in much greater depth. And I saw this as a great opportunity that I later returned to as a professional historian in the middle of my career.
And what did you find was the reaction of common folk, both in the moment, just days after learning about the sacking of the Capitol, and then in the months and years to come? What were those reactions that you found?
Well, it would differ by politics. A Federalist common person would say, well, it serves Madison right. He brought this on us. Hopefully this helps to bring him and his political party down. For people who are Democratic Republicans, which was the majority party, it's intense embarrassment. It's that this is humiliating, that a British force of only 4,500 men could just waltz into Washington, D.C. with very little resistance and then destroy these very important buildings symbolic of the Republic. There's a lot of almost despair that the United States has reached a low ebb, and that this is discrediting not just to the United States, but the entire cause of republicanism, meaning a form of government in which the people are sovereign. And so there's a lot of anxiety that unless something can be done and done quickly, that the United States is on the verge of collapse.
And that partisan divide between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, how much does that mirror some of the division we see today between the two-party system, the Republicans and the Democrats of today? What did we learn from that?
Well, often people will say, we've never been so bitterly divided as we are in our politics today. And I'm not sure that's entirely true. Very bitter divisions at the time of the War of 1812, and certainly very bitter divisions that led to the American Civil War of the 1860s. The polarity is a little different today. You can certainly find some continuities. The governing party, the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson and Madison, were relatively committed to decentralizing government. There are exceptions to this because Jefferson could do some very centralizing things like the Louisiana Purchase or imposing the embargo on American trade. But in general, that party is committed to decentralizing power, keeping taxes low, keeping the size of the federal government low. So we can certainly identify those features with one of our political parties today. The Federalists were the more nationalizing party, the party that wanted to invest more in the military. And who they were the party of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and they felt like the Jeffersonians were fools for first cutting the military and then declaring war on the British. So you can see that parts of the Federalist agenda, including a robust military, are things we'd also associate one of the same political party that we associate with states' rights. So it's not the same polarity as in politics today, but there was a lot of bitterness. So for example, in Baltimore, there was a Federalist newspaper and it got mobbed and its printing press destroyed. So the editor got a new press in and put it in a building and then fortified the building and got armed men to guard it. So the local Democratic Republicans attacked it, brought in a cannon, and ended up killing a couple of Federalists and mauling a whole lot more. So violence over politics is quite present in the United States in 1812. And so it's not that the violence that we've seen recently in the United States is unprecedented. It's just in different forms. There was nothing like the internet. There's nothing like the capacity to pick your reality and only get sources of information that fit into that perceived reality. There certainly were Federalist newspapers and Republican newspapers, and they cast things somewhat differently, but they don't have the intense appeal that internet sources of information can have. And so that's a difference between today and then.
You had mentioned Jefferson and the expansion with the Louisiana Purchase, and I wonder from a policy standpoint, is Jefferson somewhat accountable? His vision for the expansion of America and pushing the borders, is he accountable for Madison being dragged into the War of 1812 in some ways, having to grapple with Canada, wanting to look to expand the original colonies?
Well, certainly Jefferson has some responsibility for this in that he had cut the military and then he had pursued a rather confrontational diplomatic policy toward Britain. And he and Madison agreed that the first thing they should try, which they tried in 1807, was an embargo, just shutting down all American ports to exports and imports, with the notion that you would actually be inflicting pain on Britain, which was so dependent on importing American food and exporting to the United States manufactured goods. It blew up in their faces. It didn't work. It inflicted more economic pain on the United States than on Britain, and they had to back off this. Then Jefferson retires from office and he leaves the presidency in the hands of his good friend, James Madison. So now they've tried the embargo and that failed. What do you do next? Well, what do you do next is you declare war, which is what Madison and the Democratic Republicans did in 1812. And Jefferson's a great enthusiast for this war, and he thinks that American militia will be competent to just march into Canada, overwhelm the British with numbers, and that turns out also not to be true. So Madison has inherited a tough diplomatic position without the military resources to follow through on a policy of confrontation, and that means that the War of 1812 is mostly a set of American defeats.
One of the audience questions coming in early, it has to deal with Marine folklore and the perhaps passing up of a Marine detachment or a barracks in Washington. The question is, Marine folklore holds that Marine barracks in Washington, they were spared from fire because the British recognized the gallantry of the Marine detachment at the Battle of Bladensburg. Care to comment on that?
I'm not familiar with that folklore. I would be very surprised, however, if it was true. And my understanding is Navy Yard, including Marine Barracks, was actually set on fire by Americans in withdrawing so that the British would not be able to capture valuable stores in them. Now, I'm not saying the folklore is untrue. It's just that I don't know that it's true, and I would find it unlikely to be true.
Another audience question I think picks up on one of the things you were just speaking about, which was the economy. And this person writes, often in conflicts and war, you can tell a lot about following the dollar signs they've put in here.
Mhm.
What can you tell us about the economy of the 1812-1814 war?
It's a very fair observation. The war is devastating to the American economy by and large. It is a benefit to early industrialization in the Northeast because there is all this capital that had been invested in overseas shipping. And now it becomes very dangerous to engage in overseas shipping because of British naval domination. And then it also cuts off the United States from imports of British manufactured goods. So as import substitution, people start to produce things like wool and cotton textiles in New England. So there is a benefit for that sector, but in general, and there's also a benefit for some agricultural areas because there's a demand for food to feed soldiers and sailors. But it's pretty devastating for seaport communities, and it's devastating for the United States, which is unable or unwilling to tax its people enough to pay for the war. And by the end of 1814 is unable to borrow enough money to bridge the gap between their limited revenues and then their large expenditures on military forces. So that by the end of 1814, the United States is bankrupt. And if the war had gone on for another year, it's not clear how the United States would be able to wage that war because they wouldn't be able to pay their soldiers and sailors anymore.
I want to steer back to a question that I had jotted down, trying to recall some of this from high school history classes and some that I had in college. And I had remembered a discussion being oriented around the weather. And you had spoken about how the British just marched out easily after having captured Washington. I remember that there were storms that occurred within that 24-hour period that actually preserved some of the buildings, put out some of the fires. If not for the storms, there seems to be historical speculation of what might have happened next. Any indication from your research what the British had planned, how things might have turned out differently if a hurricane or thunderstorms hadn't have hit the region right at that moment?
I don't think it made any difference. The British were not planning to stay in Washington. They had too small a force to do that. This is a form of political theater. They're trying to get in and get out as quickly as possible and inflict as much conspicuous damage to buildings associated with the government. So there were very dramatic wind and rain storms that hit them in the hours before they left. But this didn't hasten their timetable to get out or change their agenda in any way.
And you mentioned the evacuation, President Madison having to leave, and you started with a picture of both James Madison and Dolly Madison. Speak to us about some of the correspondence happening there, where he's writing to Dolly and telling her they've got to get going potentially soon. What does that look like at the time?
Well, Madison has to get out sooner and get to safety. And so Dolly is left behind with several enslaved people that belong to the Madisons. And they are put to work saving some of the valuables of the family and some of the valuables of the house, including the famous Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington, which Dolly Madison is very famous for saving. She supervised, but the actual work of saving the portrait really fell to these enslaved people. But Dolly Madison, of course, is showing considerable resourcefulness and ability in managing this whole salvage operation. But it's a limited quantity that she can get out in time before the looters break in and then the British follow them.
And so you had mentioned, a bit of the bravado and the ease at which the British sacked Washington and then left Washington with similar aspirations for Baltimore, but we don't have the same outcome. What changes in between there that the British don't easily just do the same thing, walk into Baltimore and take another American city?
Well, I would say Baltimore is much better prepared. There really were no significant fortifications around Washington. One thing that militia will fight a lot better if they are entrenched than if they're out in an open field. fighting against British regulars. There were many more militia. There were at least 12,000 militia in Baltimore. They have a better commander who understands the limits of militia and also knows how to deploy them and how to inspire them. And the British force really hasn't grown in numbers. So the British were facing a force that was just about 3 times larger than theirs was, and they're well entrenched. And the British probed American defenses and didn't have much luck. And the British General Robert Ross gets shot dead by an American sniper. And then they decide, okay, well, let's send the Navy. Maybe they can break through the fortifications by the harbor, particularly Fort McHenry. And so they bombard that fort and without much effect. And then they just called the whole thing off and sailed away. So the timing of this is extremely important because it's a month right after Washington. And this is enormous relief on the part of the Democratic Republican in the majority in the country. And a sense that maybe the Republic and the United States can be saved after all.
And so I'm going to ask you to put your professor hat on for a second. And when you're teaching students about this, what do you find that they most misunderstand when it comes to the historical significance of the War of 1812, its impact on the history we study as our nation?
Well, I think they, initially they think this is kind of boring. They've seen, bits in textbooks, and it just seems like, it's pitched as a war that ended in a draw, didn't change any boundaries. It kind of seems like not that important. And I think it's enormously important for a number of reasons. One is the fact that it does end up in something of a military stalemate means that the United States has to accept the persistence of British Canada to the north. And the British start to accept the persistence of the American Republic. They kind of had fantasies that they could break the whole thing up. Not that they'd reconquer it directly, but that they could disrupt it, mess it up, and lead to the Union dissolving, and then parts of it perhaps seeking an alliance with Great Britain. And so they had these powerful fantasies of doing that, which verged on reality in late 1814, when some of the New England states do think about seceding from the Union. But after the War of 1812, the British give up on that. The British also give up on recruiting Indian allies within the United States, which they had done before the War of 1812. So the North America that we have today, in which there is a Canada and there is a United States, is a result of the War of 1812. The persistence of either of those was unclear for the War of 1812. The War of 1812 also opens up much of the West, Southwest, then Southwest, places like Alabama and Mississippi, to American occupation and the dislocation of native peoples. So the Indian removal of the 1830s is made possible by American victories in the War of 1812. So it's not a war without significance. It's just we have to look at this for the significance in a new way. And when we do, we see that the War of 1812 is extremely important in the history of this continent.
And talking about holding the country together, is the burning of Washington that moment that builds that unity, or is it the war in its entirety that brings the country together and it becomes a union that cannot be broken apart, at least by the British, until we do it ourselves later in the 1860s? Is it that?
Well, that's pretty important. I mean, it's not that the United States is brought together permanently. There is a kind of a feel-good period right after the war where Americans largely forget the defeats of the war and focus on the victories, such as at Baltimore and at New Orleans. And Andrew Jackson becomes a great political hero. But there are enduring divisions in American politics, and those divisions it's like a kaleidoscope that rearranges them. They persist in somewhat different combinations, and they would come together in a very powerful combination that would lead to the American Civil War in the 1860s. So there is a surge of nationalism right after the war, but it's not a sufficient surge of nationalism or enduring enough to hold the country together when it starts to come apart over slavery, the expansion of slavery during the 1850s.
Those slaves that were enlisted to the British cause, what comes of them after the War of 1812?
The British take them away as free people and settle them and give them land. The largest number of them go to Nova Scotia and are settled in communities just outside of Halifax. And it's my understanding that a majority of the so-called Afro-Nova Scotians are the descendants of these refugees from the War of 1812. The secondary location the British took many of the refugees to, including most of the Colonial Marines, they went to Trinidad. And there is an enduring community within Trinidad, which is a multi-ethnic, multiracial place. It's an island in the West Indies, close to South America. There's a community to this day in the vicinity of where the Colonial Marines settled, and they are called the Americans. No A in the front and a K instead of a C at the end, the Americans. And I've met several people who are the descendants of this community, some of whom now live back within the United States or who live in Britain. The British did their best to do right by the formerly enslaved people who run away and help them in the war.
And the looters that you spoke of earlier that were in before the British troops chased them out in the halls of the White House, were they opportunistic simply because Washington was burning, or was this a deeper resentment of the government that represented them? What have you found in your research that speaks to that?
There's no suggestion there's a political motive, and the city's not yet on fire. The British haven't gotten into the city at the time the looters are going. It's just an opportunity by people they were called rabble. We don't know anything more about them. We don't have any names. Nobody's prosecuted for it. So the assumption is that they are poorer people, presumably poorer white people of the city, who it's just opportunistic. You can get in and grab some silver, and that's what they do.
And so the British-American relationship after the war, how are Americans viewing British post-War of 1812?
There's still a very powerful strain of Anglophobia, of perceiving the British as still meaning to do harm to the United States. This is especially strong in the South, where they resented the assistance that the British had provided to enslaved people to escape. And so much of American expansion after that is presented as a kind of defensive imperialism, as if we don't grab Texas or we don't grab the Southwest and California, these are places that will fall under British domination and they will use it to hem in the United States. So there's a continued resentment and an almost paranoid sense that the British are out to get us, which is politically very convenient to politicians who want to play to the popular animus against the British. And then this will continue through the American Civil War.
And one more audience question I want to sneak in here, because I think it's important. What's the impact of the burning of Washington by the British on President James Madison, his legacy? What's the overall impact there?
Well, it's certainly very negative at the time. Now, it's surprising that Madison makes quite a political comeback once there's a peace treaty. That there's so much relief that the United States seems to get off lightly in the peace treaty. They don't lose any territory, despite the fact that at the time of the peace treaty, the British were occupying eastern Maine, they were occupying northern Michigan, they were occupying the Sea Islands of Georgia. They still had Tangier Island. The United States was virtually bankrupt. Wasn't clear they were going to be able to fight on anything. And the British, for their own diplomatic reasons, give the United States a peace treaty that just says, let's just call the whole thing off. The British were facing renewed difficulties in Europe, and they didn't want their troops to be tied down in North America any longer. It looked like, particularly after the defeat in Baltimore and also defeat in Plattsburgh, that conquering, that really finishing the job of finishing off the United States was not going to. So the British just said, "The hell with it," and gave the United States a good peace treaty. And there's this giddy relief in the country. There are all these celebrations, and Madison's a great beneficiary of it. And after that, the Federalist Party goes into a tailspin and is wiped out in elections of 1816 and 1818 and 1820. So the Federalist Party virtually doesn't exist by 1820. And James Madison leaves office with great popularity.
So I'd be remiss with the Jefferson Educational Society situated in Erie, Pennsylvania. I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on the Battle of Lake Erie. How important was that battle to the War of 1812, and why did it need to happen?
Well, it was very important in that the United States is trying to invade Canada. And initially they tried to do it without any kind of significant naval force in the Great Lakes. That didn't go very well in 1812. And so in 1813, they start to build lake fleets in Lake Champlain, Lake Ontario, and Lake Erie. And it enables them to play comeback, because in 1812, it was just catastrophic for the United States. They lost Detroit. The British in native allies were able to raid deep into Ohio. And by gaining the naval supremacy in Lake Erie, they're able to crush and capture most of the British flotilla, or all of the British flotilla on the lake. They're able to retake Detroit and then renew their invasion of Canada. And so that's very important. But one of the consequences is that after that, the British become much more cautious in preserving their lake fleet on Ontario. So they will not seek the same kind of naval battle on Lake Ontario that they had risked in Lake Erie, and which had gone so badly for them. And that means that the British are able to preserve the stalemate in Lake Ontario, which is strategically more important than Lake Erie.
And so looking at it, almost out of time here, just one last question, Dr. Taylor. Looking at the political division between the parties, looking at the cultural observations that you've made, the social observations you've made, if we're to take a few key lessons away with us, learning from what the War of 1812 can teach us and apply them to today, what might those be in your opinion?
Well, that one would be that wars never play out the way that you predict they will. And that obviously war needs to be a very last resort. That this is a war that produced a lot of tragedy, a lot of suffering for soldiers and civilians on both sides. And that there really was enormous incompetence, particularly on the American side in this war. Now, there are also moments of great heroism and true military ability also displayed. But in the overall war effort, it's not a good record, particularly in the invasions of Canada. It certainly suggests that you shouldn't go to war unless you're prepared for it. But you always understand that war is never purely military. It's always in a political context. In war, you're trying to maintain support on your own home front, and you're trying to weaken that in your opposition. So that it's never a real good idea to go into war unprepared, and it's never good to go into a war that is deeply unpopular with a very substantial minority of Americans.
And of course, people who are interested can find out much, much more about this historically significant war in your book, Dr. Alan Taylor, the When the British Attacked the Capitol. That's what we were talking about here today. But your fantastic book, The Civil War of 1812: American Citizens, British Subjects, Irish Rebels, and Indian Allies. Historian, author, and professor, two-time Pulitzer Prize winning Dr. Alan Taylor. Thank you so much for your time, energy, and efforts on this research and sharing it with us here today.
Well, thank you.
And thanks to all of you watching along at home, thank you so much for tuning in. Of course, for more information about both upcoming programs and past discussions available now for on-demand streaming, please head over to jeserie.org. There you'll find a wide range of publications as well, from timely reads on current topics to reports, essays, and more. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.